We'd love to see you there. And we also have a Birds and Blooms Valentine's Edition. That's an event that's also at the Wolf Lake State Fish Hatchery, and many local conservation organizations will be there. There'll be lots of fun to be had. It's from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. on Valentine's Day, which is on a Saturday this year. Kent will be leading a great backyard bird count walk from 11 to 1 at the hatchery that day. Dress appropriately, subtract 10 degrees at least from the temperature, and dress for that temperature is what I recommend. We'll be making pine cone bird feeders, write a nature themed love poem, all sorts of other activities. There'll be hot cocoa and cookies and coffee, and it's fun for all ages. So tell your friends, and hopefully, we'll see you at that. And then just looking ahead a month, our February monthly meeting will be on the 23rd, and our own Susan Schneider will be presenting a talk on birds and climate change and update. So refreshments and social time will start at 6:30 and the talk begins at 7. And unless we have some more inclement weather, we will be at the People's Church for that. I think that's all the announcements I have. So let's move on to our speaker tonight. Allison Vlog grew up birding in Southwest Michigan and has since let birds take her around the continent. She's been a bird guide in Alaska's Pribilof Islands, as well as northern Michigan for Kirtland's warblers. And she's conducted migration counts around Lake Superior and from Monterey Bay for 7 years. When she's not birding, Allison is in the Traverse City area in the hospitality industry. So tonight she's going to tell us about the experiences that she and Tim Bearwald, a fellow migration counter, had on Manitou Island off the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So thank you, Allison, for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be joining you tonight. And it's funny, I hadn't really thought a whole lot about Manitou for the last, few months. I was working out in California doing the migration count at Point Pinos, where we see hundreds of thousands of Pacific loons and tens of thousands of surf scoters over the course of the season. But I was thinking about Manitou Island today and wondering what it must look like right now. I'm actually in Traverse City right now, but I'm spending the winter in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan near Whitefish Point, and there's about 4 feet of snow, if not more, on the ground there right now. So I was just trying to imagine what Manitou would look like with that much snow and how challenging it would be to get around in that very remote place. But my own relationship with Manitou Island began in the fall of 2020. Copper Country Audubon Society, I think they go by Copper Country Bird Club now, but they had been doing migratory investigations in Manitou Island for quite a while, and they had been fairly short trips out there, but in the fall of 2020, they wanted to have more consistent coverage to see what sort of water bird migration was happening there and compare it with the count that was going on at Whitefish Point. And so I was out on Manitou Island for 2 weeks in October of 2020. And Tim Bearwald was also on Manitou Island for the 2 weeks. Well, he was supposed to be there for the 2 weeks after I was there. But as we soon came to learn, Lake Superior sort of makes the rules out there, especially off the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so I went out to Manitou a little bit early because of what the weather systems were dictating. And then Tim also had to leave a little bit earlier that season. But through the course of being out there for that month in October, we were able to get some really cool water bird comparisons with what was happening in Pictured Rocks and also at Whitefish Point. And I think that Tim and I both really became enthralled with Manitou through the time that we spent out there that fall, both as a really interesting place to learn about migration, but also as just a place where you were very close to Lake Superior elements. And when I left Manitou Island for that first time, I didn't expect that I would ever be back, and it wasn't because I didn't want to be back. I had definitely fallen in love with that place. It was because it's so hard to get out there. It's not a place that you just wake up one day and you're like, oh, I'm gonna go out to Manitou Island. No, it takes a lot of planning, and even with those planning, like Lake Superior gets the final say on whether or not those plans can actually be followed through on. And I've now been back to Manitou 3 times, once for a spring water bird count, and then twice with Tim as he started doing hawk and owl banding out there, which is what this program tonight is going to be about. And I'm very happy to be able to share that with you. But before we get too deeply into that, let's just take a look at some of the characteristics of Manitou Island and see if the slide will progress here. There we go. I haven't done a virtual presentation for since like 2021, so this is a bit of a throwback to the past. But anyway, this is Manitou Island, and I will have a picture of it in relation to the Keweenaw Peninsula soon. But it's a fairly large island. It's over 1,000 acres. It's 3 miles from the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and it's separated from the mainland by what's described as treacherous currents. It's a fairly dangerous place to get to if you don't know what you're doing. And Lake Superior is just omnipresent when you're on that island. Even on the interior, you can always hear it, so you never forget that it's there. We count on the far eastern side of that island, even to the right of where it says Manitou Island Light Station Preserve out on that spit there. And you can see there's like a large interior lake in the middle there that's called Perch Lake. The composition of Manitou Island, it's mostly public land. There's a few little private inholdings where people have little cabins that they go to or fish camps. And then there's a Keweenaw Land Trust preserve where the lighthouse itself is, and that's where we're based out of. The habitat there is very thick forest. Spruce and birch are dominant. There's some swamp maple as well. And then the one big inland lake called Perch Lake. The beaches are either low cliffs or gravelly, rocky. There are a lot of agates, which is something that is another plus about Manitou. And there aren't a whole lot of mammals on Manitou Island. Um, Snowshoe hare are super common, which is cool. They're basically tame too. They just hop around the yard and munch grass and browse all day. And last spring, I did make it over to Perch Lake for the first time ever. And I was surprised to find beavers there. I had no idea that there were beavers on Manitou Island, but there were. But because there are no large mammals, there's no deer, there's no moose, the forest on Manitou is just incredibly dense. And if you're walking around there, it's a good idea to have safety glasses because otherwise you're just going to get poked in the eye, slapped in the face with spruce. It's unpleasant. The accommodations on Manitou are fairly Spartan. This lighthouse, if it looks really similar to the one at Whitefish Point, it's because they were both constructed at the same time under the same governmental act. And that was in the 1860s. And there is no electricity unless you have solar panels, which Tim had a great solar panel setup that definitely made life a little more comfortable out there. There's not running water unless you count the water that comes through the roof when it rains, unfortunately. And there are a lot of mice. The first time that I went to Manitou Island that October, my partner Trip was coming up from Florida, and we were both trying to race this weather system that had us leaving for the island like 2 days before we had planned on it. And I had asked him, I was like, "Do you need me to get anything?" And he wanted one specific type of fishing line that I wasn't able to find. And I was like, "Can you bring some mouse traps?" And he didn't bring the mouse traps. So the first thing that we did was we climbed up to the top of the light tower because that was the only place where we could get cell signal. And we called it the Tower of Knowledge of Good and Evil because that's where we learned what was going on in the world. And we used that limited cell signal to figure out how to construct a mousetrap when you don't have mousetraps. And we used a bucket and water, and I think we got over 160 mice that first October that we were out there. So that is the one mammal that Manitou Island has in the most abundance. And one of the things to me that has become really special over the course of the time that I've spent on Manitou is just how close you feel to migration in an island setting, and especially an island as remote as Manitou, where you and whoever is out there looking at birds with you, you're going to be the only people on that island. The same weather systems that are affecting your coming and going, they're the weather systems that are affecting what's happening with migration. So you feel this connection to the birds that you might not have at a place where the weather isn't as constant in the back of your mind. Um, there was one day that I was doing the water bird count there in the spring, and the wind was from the north, and some rough-legged hawks had flown out over the lake. And I was like, why are you flying north into the wind over this huge, immense water crossing? And most hawks don't even like to fly across the water, but rough-legged hawks, which nest up on the tundra, they're more prone to go across water than the other ones. Roughies with transmitters on them have even been seen to like fly across Hudson and James Bay, so they're not afraid of crossing Lake Superior. But over the course of that morning, I counted the same number of rough-legged hawks coming back to Manitou Island from over the lake because I had seen leave, and there was just one that I hadn't seen come back yet. And it was maybe an hour and a half after I had seen it go out. And this hawk came in, and I picked it up really distantly. And I was like, man, this bird is flying just really low. It was a super flat lake day. The swell wasn't really big. And as this hawk came closer to the lighthouse, I could see that every few flaps that it took, like its wingtips were actually dragging in the water. I could feel the weariness in that bird. And I was like, is it going to make it to shore? Is it going to make it to shore? And it actually landed in Lake Superior, just exhausted, I guess. And it was harassed by herring gulls. And herring gulls, if you've seen them going after birds that are tired from water crossings, you know that they can take pretty big birds. I've seen them successfully take down sharp-shinned hawks before. And this roughie was able to fight off the herring gulls and fight off a bald eagle that took a pass at it. And it was able to lift itself back up out of the lake after a few minutes and make it to shore. But I could, feel the weariness of that bird just because on Manitou you get to watch those sorts of things and feel part of them. And another cool thing that puts you right out there with what's happening on Manitou is I like to sleep on the light tower when it's warm enough. You can see the northern lights sometimes and hear pastoring flight calls as they're flying out over the lake, and it's just a really special thing. So, Manitou is a wonderful place to feel like you're part of migration. But in particular, hawk migration in spring on Manitou is phenomenal. This is a picture of what the sky looks like on a typical day above Manitou Island. And the highest single day count that I can find was in April 2006. I guess an estimated 1,300 raptors were in the air at one time above Manitou Island. And it is cool. You can just like look up from the light tower or laying out on the beach or on the dock and just see like a procession of golden eagles and turkey vultures, broad-winged hawks just swirling over the island trying to figure out how they're going to navigate the water crossing. And it's phenomenal. These are what the shores look like on Manitou. We call it the welcoming committee. Peregrine falcons and sharp-shinned hawks are both bird-eating species of raptors. And it's not just hawks that are migrating past Manitou. There's a lot of passerines, songbirds, landbirds that are doing that too. And they'll eventually, some of them will turn around and come back to the island and decide they don't want to do that great big water crossing over Lake Superior. And when they do that, there's oftentimes the welcoming committee of sharp-shinned hawks and peregrine falcons and merlins waiting on the shore to pick off the ones that are tired. So there's a lot of different ways to watch hawks on Manitou Island, and if you walk around in the woods, this is a pretty common scene. There's just feather piles everywhere. There are lots and lots of songbirds on Manitou Island. During seasons of migration, lots of sparrows, lots of warblers, lots of flickers. These are flicker feathers on the right. You can see the nice yellow shaft. But there's not a lot of bird song on Manitou. The songbirds that are there are hiding and generally in states of alarm just because there are so many sharp-shinned hawks, which are very adept at eating smaller birds. So it's an interesting place to watch how all that plays out. But before Tim had started doing hawk and owl research on Manitou Island, nobody knew what was happening with migrating owls on Manitou. Nobody had banded any type of bird on Manitou. And this picture, within that red circle, is a northern sawa owl that was captured on a trail cam that we brought out with us that first October that Copper Country Audubon had us go out for that month-long survey. And other than that, and seeing some long-eared owls, some short-eared owls come in off the lake while we were doing that water bird count, there wasn't really owl data from Manitou Island, and that was an area of knowledge that Tim, who had done quite a bit of banding at that point, Tim just saw an opportunity to gain some of that knowledge about hawk and owl migration on Manitou. And 2024 was the first year that Tim was able to go out there and do sort of an experimental banding season. We weren't out there for that long, but he wanted to know in what capacity migrating owls visited Manitou Island. He wanted to know what sort of physical condition the raptors on Manitou were in. Were they at a good weight? Were they eating well? Did they have full crops? Those are things that you can figure out when you're banding a bird and you have it in hand and you can give it that sort of intimate examination. He was hoping that through banding, he would be able to get a better idea of the abundance of migratory raptors on Manitou because in some places when you're counting migration, it's pretty obvious. Birds are flying past, they're not coming back. That's not the case on Manitou. These hawks are trying to figure out the water crossing and they're actively hunting. So, you see 30 sharp-shinned hawks, and then you see 30 sharp-shinned hawks the next day. Is that the same 30 sharp-shinned hawks, or are there 60? Are there more? Banding these birds is a good way to get a better idea of the actual abundance. And another really cool thing about banding projects is you always have this hope that you're going to have a bird fly into your net that's already wearing a band because that means that somebody else has banded it at a different station and you can find out about where that bird has been, how long it's lived. All of this information goes to the USGS bird banding lab. It's just this huge repository of information. You have to be permitted to band, not just anybody can do it, because it is something that you have to do properly to not harm the bird that you're looking at. But that is the cool thing is you have a chance to catch a bird that already has been banded by somebody else and learn more about its life. And of course, there was the appeal of being the first person to ever band on Manitou Island. And Tim had been doing hawk research on Brockway Mountain on the Keweenaw Peninsula and was just like, I want to know, have a better idea what's going on with hawks and owls on Manitou because I think that really cool things are happening there. So this picture just sort of shows Manitou in the context of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Manitou's over there on the far right of the screen. There's the tip of the Keweenaw. Copper Harbor is a little bit west of there. The Keweenaw is just like this big migration corridor for all sorts of birds, and they get funneled as they get near the tip of the peninsula. And then Manitou Island is even a smaller part of that tip of the peninsula, further concentrating and collecting the migrating birds that are going out over Lake Superior. And there's just a crazy amount of birds on Manitou. That's always been my experience there. And Manitou is also sort of centrally positioned between other raptor banding stations. You've got Hawk Ridge in Duluth, Thunder Cape in Ontario, there's Whitefish Point in the eastern Upper Peninsula, and then Mackinac Straits. These are all places that band hawks and or owls. And Tim's thinking was, Manitou and the Keweenaw are sort of in the middle of all of these banding stations, so it could be an ideal place to recapture some of these birds that have been banded elsewhere. And in 2024, he was able to go out to Manitou and start answering some of those questions that he had laid out. And it happened on really short notice. We had been talking a little bit about going to Manitou, and it just like was hard to find somebody that would take us out, and the weather conditions were a little bit sketchy. And then I think it was on a Tuesday or a Monday or something, and Tim called and said, "Hey, do you think you can make it to the boat launch on Thursday?" And I was like, "Huh, let me check with my manager, the restaurant where I work." And she said, "Yeah, it's slow season for us, so you can go." So 2 days later, I was at the boat launch, helping get everything on the boat, and it didn't seem real. And we went out to Manitou really with no idea of what was going to happen. We were actively banding for about a week out there, and what we had was super exciting. The way that we were, primary means that we were using to band out there was using what's called a dogaza or a DG setup. It's basically like a triangle or a rectangle of nuts, and these nuts are on pulleys. So basically, you have in the middle, you can see like the little rocks there, and I think there might even be a pigeon in there, which we'll talk about more later. But you have a lure bird, either a pigeon or a house sparrow or something like that, inside the nets, and the hawk will be approaching from the outside of the net. And when it hits the outside of the net, these nets are on like triggers and pulleys, and the net will collapse, and the hawk will be trapped. And you'll be in a blind not far from the net, and you'll run out and take that hawk out of the net. Um, but here's a close-up of the pigeons. Not, I don't know if there's a bander out there that takes better care of their pigeons than Tim does. Um, we brought, I think, like 5 or 6 pigeons out there the first season, and we left with the same amount of pigeons that we went out there with, which is what you want to do. But you have these little leather vests on the pigeon. They're sort of like armored vests, even though you hope that the hawk is not ever going to get close enough to the pigeon to actually grab it. You just want to make sure that the pigeon has the best possible advantage. And there's a ring on this vest, and you run a line through the ring, and then you're sitting in a blind away from the setup, and you're raising and lowering the pigeon on that line. And when you do that, the pigeon is going to flap, and that motion is going to attract a hungry hawk that's in the area. And it's pretty fun to sit in the blind and work with the pigeon and just always be looking for a hawk coming in on that pigeon. And this sort of shows just how we had the setup arranged in the yard. We had a few different um, nets, and in fact, in 2025, we had another net setup that's not in this picture, but the Pigeon DG was the main net setup that we used. There's a blind, the camo blind where we were sitting with the lines, and then we had another net set up here on this ridge. And in 2024, we usually had a sparrow in that net setup. And hawks would come from the interior of the island out to the yard to hunt and also to take a look at the lake crossing. And they would spy the pigeons that we were flapping and come in for a closer look was the idea. And that idea definitely manifested into reality, as you can see in this picture here. Um, when I went out to Manitou with Tim that first time, I did not have really much banding experience at all. And Manitou is the sort of place where it's a bad idea to be out there by yourself. You want a buddy because it's so remote. You want somebody to be able to call for help or just be there if something were to go amiss. And I thought that that was going to be me on Manitou that first season. And as it turned out, we started catching so many sharp-shinned hawks within a very short amount of time of even getting the net set up that Tim was like, "Well, you're gonna learn how to band." And so he was a very, very patient teacher, way more patient than the hawks. But when you band a bird, you take certain information off the bird, and then we put them in these cans just so that they're more contained and calmer. If they were out where they could see everything, they would just be freaking out, and they're actually really calm in the cans. But you put the aluminum band on them. You can see some bands with the red marker there. You put the band on the leg really carefully and make sure that it's closed properly. It doesn't have a gap. It's not overlapped. It's not too tight on the bird. And you size the leg of the bird, in fact, before you even put the band on to make sure that you're using the right band size for that individual bird. And then you take other plumage and measurement information. You weigh the bird, you take the length of the tail, length of the wing cord, you check and see if it's got feather lice or flat flies. If you notice those types of parasites, you make a note of it in the banding data. You blow in the belly and on the keel area to see how heavy the bird is, how thin it is, what sort of condition, physical condition it's in. And then you also blow on the feathers around the throat to see how full the crop is, and see, how well has that bird been eating. So you take all of that sort of information and write it down. And um, we were doing quite a lot of that, as you can see from all of these sharp-shinned hawk tails in the cans. And I wrote in my journal that Tim is a very patient teacher. His methods are far less painful than the Sharpies who slash, grab, foot, and bite. Don't put your hands there. Bet you wish you could keep my feet under control. Ha, you let your guard down. I've taken so many talons today that my hands have resigned themselves to that sort of pain. I mean, you can see here that the sharpshins really, they're well named, they're sharp. Um, at the end of that first spring in 2024, where we were doing this exploratory season, um, I was going to take a sharp shinned out of the net and it bit me. And I didn't even realize that I was doing this, but I told the bird, I was like, "That's okay, you can bite me, just please don't foot me." And Tim heard me say that, and he was like, "Well, you've graduated the first stage of banding now that you know that you'd rather be bitten than grabbed by the foot." So evenings in the lighthouse, I'd be like putting antibacterial stuff on my wounds and just sitting there and drinking tea. It was an interesting time. Um, but that first season that we were out there, when we were only banding for a week, we ended up banding 81 sharp-shinned hawks, which is just an incredible amount of birds to catch, especially in a place that was new. Nobody had an idea of what sort of banding setup would be the ideal one. Tim just sort of went with his gut, which was, of course, informed by the other banding that he had done. And it turned out really well because 81 sharp-shinned hawks is a lot of sharp-shinned hawks. And most of them, as you can see here, were young birds. They were not adults. The adults would have come through in greater numbers earlier in the season before we got out there. And these are second year birds that had, made it through their first winter, which is pretty cool. Um, the first really big trial, I guess, of their lives for a lot of reasons. And we also banded 4 merlins out there that season. Um, we got 2 American kestrels, which were super cute and super feisty. And we got 2 northern harriers, which were some of my favorites. They're just super cool birds. We got 1 broad-winged hawk. It was one of the last birds that we caught before weather came in on the last day that we were there, and we knew that we had to start taking the nets down. And it was really a cool bird to sort of end that exploratory season on. Tim was holding it, and we were thinking about all the places that this bird, it's a species that winters in the Amazon basin. And Tim was like, "You've been in more countries in the last, few weeks than I've been in my whole life." And that was just a really cool thing to think about and to hold that bird in our hand and release it for the next part of its journey and think about the questions that we hoped that this banding effort could answer. And we did really, really well for that exploratory season. We got 88 hawks and falcons during that week that we were actively banding there. And we weren't just limited to diurnal birds either. We didn't sleep a lot out there. And Tim really wanted to know about hawks or about owls that were migrating through too, in particular long-eared owls, which are a species that doesn't get banded in huge numbers really at any North American banding site. And we caught 24 northern sawa owls and we caught 11 long-eared owls, which was a great number for both of those species. And we left the island having caught 88 hawks and falcons and 35 owls in just a week. And during that same time period, Mackinac Straits Banding Station had banded just 20 hawks and 8 owls. And we noticed some differences between conditions on Manitou and like what the flight was doing under certain weather conditions. In a lot of places where hawks are counted or banded during migration, you expect the busy parts of their daily rhythm to be more in like the late morning, early afternoon. On Manitou, we didn't have that luxury. We would be up pretty late with the owls, in particular, Tim. He would always make it later than I would. And he'd be like, well, wake me up in the morning when the sharpshins start to fly. And the sharpshins always started to fly before we really wanted them to, because basically the sun would come up and the sharpshins would get up and start hunting. And some days the flight on Manitou just kept going until sunset, which is something that's different from a lot of raptor migration sites where you expect it to die off in late afternoon or mid-afternoon. And then one of the other things that was a surprise to us was that some of our busiest banding days were days with strong northeast winds. At other Great Lakes sites, that wind direction in the spring would just completely shut the hawk flight down, but that was not what we experienced on Manitou. Um, and we think, especially after having been out there in 2025, that the reason that it was good on north winds was that these were birds that maybe hadn't come out to Manitou that day. Maybe they had come out the day before, the previous day with favorable winds, but they were hungry on those northeast wind days and not wanting to migrate, so they were just sort of circulating around hunting, and that's why they were so active on what seemed to be unfavorable winds. And my favorite takeaway from Manitou was that the birds that we were banding, they were in really good body condition. They were eating well. They had full crops, and another place where you check the fat on raptors is their wing pits, their armpits, and a lot of them had fat reserves there. So these were birds that were healthy and strong for their migrations and had been eating well. So that was a really cool thing that we learned in 2024 about the hawks on Manitou Island. And we did catch some hawks that had already been banded. One of them had been banded at Whitefish Point in May 2022, so 2 springs earlier. And the other sharpshin that we caught that had already been banded, she had been banded at Whitefish Point just 6 days before she came into our nets at Manitou. Whitefish Point is 250 miles from Manitou, roughly. And if you do a whole water crossing, which who knows, maybe a sharpshin does that. We'll have to get some transmitters on them to know for sure. It could be less mileage that way. But yeah, it was delightful to catch these birds and learn a little bit more about how long they were living and where they had been just a few days before in the case of that one that was banded 6 days before at Whitefish Point. And we also had some owls that had been already banded. The one that we caught on Manitou had been banded in Wisconsin the fall before. And I think that probably this number has changed since the last time that I gave this presentation, but at least 4 of the saw-whets that were banded in spring 2024 were caught again. 2 were caught 3 days later in Copper Harbor because Tim continued to band in Copper Harbor after we got back from Manitou Island that spring. One of those saw-whets was caught about 2 weeks later at Whitefish Point, and then one was caught the following fall near Duluth, Minnesota. So we were also able to learn some more about where the saw-whets that were coming through Manitou were going. And when we left Manitou in 2024, Tim had the goals of going back in 2025 and having a full 2-month field season and being able to get transmitters or MODIS tags for sharp-shinned hawks, saw-whet owls, and long-eared owls. And we were able to pull off that full-length field season last year And when we went out, it was early April, and to our knowledge, it was the earliest that anybody had been out to Manitou Island, in particular for looking at patterns of migrating birds. And true to Manitou, when we put in on the Keweenaw Peninsula, this is Captain Travis. He has gotten us out to Manitou safely every time that I've been out there. He has a fishing charter company, and yeah, we trust him with our lives. He's wonderful. But it was a nice day on the mainland. By the time we got out to Manitou, you can see the weather had changed completely. It was foggy and gray, and that's very typical for Manitou. It does its own thing. We had this really eclectic cargo of pigeons and rebar and solar panels and chainsaw, propane, all the things that we would need to survive out there and also to have a field season. And there we are at Square Bay. It's a short walk to the lighthouse, which is basically just on the other side of that ridge. We were very happy that we were able to land in Square Bay because the alternative at the dock, that would have been like a mile walk through all the trees that had fallen down over the winter, and it would have been absolutely miserable bringing that gear to the lighthouse. I don't know if we would have been able to do it or how long it would have taken us to do it. So it was nice to have the shorter walk. Um, but it was very much still winter on Manitou when we got out there. I had never seen that much snow there. The before the earliest I had been out there had been like very late April, and winter still had its hold, and we were there so early that we were like, has migration started yet? It had. This is what the yard looked like. There was a huge puddle. You can sort of see the mist nets all wrapped up for the day. Those were the owl nets that we would use at night. And yeah, there that was the amount of snow that was still on the interior of the island. This far right photo is the trail, which was just a bunch of post holing because we thought about bringing snowshoes out, but we already had so much stuff on the boat that the snowshoes didn't make it. So we just had to sort of punch through the snow. And mornings on Manitou would start. We'd wake up to things like a mouse trap snapping or water coming through the ceiling. There are interesting ways to wake up, look out the window at the yard, see that winter was still very much there. And then our early morning routines, we'd raise the nets, the dogazas, so that they could dry out from the frost or the dew from the night before. You can see there's a bow net in the middle as well. That was a secondary way of trapping that we used. And before the hawks started moving, I would usually go up on the lighthouse and just count everything that was moving, whether it was a songbird, whether it was a raptor, whether it was a water bird. There was a really prominent Canada goose flight that, because we were out there so early in the season, we were able to document, and that was the first time that that Canada goose flight had been documented from Manitou, so that was really cool. Um, this was the view from the light tower, just beautiful looking out over Lake Superior. And then after banding hawks all day, we would keep going at night. That's what the sky would look like from the yard. It's absolutely beautiful, the stars when they were out. And this is one of the owl nets. We used more of a passive trapping method for the owls. Instead of using lures, we would still use like a collar with a recording of the owl that would, with the hopes that it would draw the owl to the net, but we weren't using a bait bird like a pigeon or anything. And we had different setups for boreal owls, for long-eared owls, and for saw-whet owls. And those collars were like each setup of net had a boreal owl recording, a saw-whet owl recording, a long-eared owl recording. Um, and then oftentimes there would be a woodcock displaying in the yard, and a few nights when we were coming back to the lighthouse after opening up the owl nets, there would actually be a woodcock that had ended up in one of the owl nets in the yard. And while I was out there this spring, we banded three American woodcocks, which was really fun. They're a cool bird to see up close, just have beautiful plumage and a really unique look, and I enjoy letting them go because it's fun to watch them sort of just like shake their feathers off and shuffle back um, into the place where they came from. That was cool too because I always just assumed that it was the same woodcocks that we were hearing every night out on Manitou. But the ones that we caught were all individual birds, different individuals. So it was like, cool, there's more woodcocks on Manitou than I thought there were. But yeah, we caught boreal owls in 2025 and saw-whet owls. It was a good boreal owl spring, and that was one of our hopes is that we would um, get boreal owl out there, which had not yet been recorded on Manitou Island, and we did. We caught at least three. But the results from the time that I was out there, I wasn't able to be out for the full season. Tim actually had three total assistants join him in the 2025 season. I was there for the first stint, and then Carrie was there, and then Camille was there for the last little bit of the season. Because Manitou's a place where it's kind of hard to be out there that remote for a full 2 month season. And that's one of the reasons why I respect what Tim is doing so much. But because I was out there for the earliest part of the season, we had a lot of really rough weather. At least 3 of the days that I was out there, the weather was just too bad to open the nets at all. So there was a lot of sort of waiting around and being antsy. And even on the days where we could open the nets, we weren't able to keep them open all day, or it would be too windy at night to do owls. But this is our first bird of 2025. It was a great bird to start the season on. It was a second year Northern Harrier. And you can tell that it's a male because it's got the yellow eyes. Female Harriers have brown eyes, which is something cool that I learned on Manitou. And in the full length of Tim's season in 2025, the full 2 months that he was out there, he caught 9 Northern Harriers. Here's just a beautiful close-up of that bird's face. He also caught a handful of American kestrels. This was probably my favorite bird that we caught during the 2 weeks that I was out there. She she was tiny, but she was really fierce. She drew more blood, I think, from me than any of the other birds that I had in my hands while I was out there. And when I released her, she definitely had some of my blood on her talons, and she left like some of her down in my hair. So I thought that was a pretty cool trade. But the reason that this kestrel in particular was so awesome was Tim is a genius, and he designed these taxidermied starlings that are like battery operated with video game controllers. So you press a button and the starling flicks a wing or moves its head. And he wasn't sure to the degree of success that Robo Starling, as we called it, would have. But Robo Starling caught this kestrel. It was the first bird on Manitou that Robo Starling had lured in. So that was pretty awesome. Um, and yeah, with a longer season. Tim caught an incredible number of sharp-shinned hawks. I think that while I was out there, we just caught 9, but over the full duration, he caught 364. And this is a significant number of sharp-shinned hawks for any site in North America that bans hawks, and probably reason in and of itself that a full-time banding station should be at Manitou Island. That number is absolutely worthy of something like that. And like I mentioned earlier, you get more adult sharp-shinned hawks earlier in the season. So when I was out there, there were more adults, and then as the season went on, that demographic shifted to second-year birds, which are browner, as you can see in this picture. And I think Tim caught 8 or 9 harriers. I do have a slide that has all of those numbers from the 2025 season, but this is a beautiful adult male northern harrier, one of the coolest plumages, I think, of any North American raptor. And it was the first one that I had seen in hand. So we were delighted to have that. And Tim also banded 25 long-eared owls, which is more than double the number that we had in 2024. And again, like a really good example of why Manitou Island is such an important site to learn about how raptors move around the Great Lakes. Before Tim had started his banding project on the Keweenaw Peninsula and at Manitou Island, I think that fewer than 20 long-eared owls had ever been documented on the Keweenaw Peninsula. So it was awesome to have, in a season, a number that was larger than what had been known before banding efforts started in that area. And Tim also banded 72 northern saw owls. And we only had one during the time that I was out there that already had a band on it. And it was awesome because Tim had actually been the person that banded this bird, and he had banded it the previous summer at Whitefish Point. So that bird had been in Tim's hands at two different banding stations, 2 different years. So, how special is that? And we did get 3 boreal owls, and Tim had banded a fourth boreal in the Keweenaw Peninsula before we got out to Manitou as well. And I love boreals. They are not that large as far as owls go, but they have a lot of personality per ounce, and they have just like very cool feathery feet. They're a very northern looking owl, and sometimes Tim would be coming in from a check that I hadn't gone out with him on, and I could hear, a boreal owl just shifting around in the can, and Tim didn't even have to tell me that he had a boreal. The boreal was telling me itself by the way that it was kicking around. So they're awesome. But yeah, this is the slide that shows the numbers of everything that Tim caught, both in 2024 and 2025 on Manitou. So 408 diurnal raptors over the course of the whole season in 2025 and 116 owls. You can see that most of those hawks were sharp-shinned hawks. Most of those owls were saw-whet owls. I am so envious that after I left, Tim was able to get a couple goshawks, a peregrine, and the short-eared owl, which is a bird that does not get banded very often. Um, at least on this continent, and I would have loved to see that, but I'm delighted that Tim had the opportunity to have one of those in hand. And there were, again, some cool recapture data. So one of the sharp-shinned hawks that Tim banded on Manitou in 2025 was recaptured 5 days later at Whitefish Point, which is the yellow dot to the right of the screen. And pretty cool because if you think back to the sharpshin that we caught that had also been at Whitefish Point in 2024, it was about the same amount of days, but that bird in 2024 had gone from Whitefish Point to Manitou, and the one in 2025 went from Manitou to Whitefish Point. So, what exactly are these sharpshin hawks doing? I guess that's something that we still need to find out. But they seem to travel both west to east and east to west in the spring over Superior. So that to me is really interesting. And I just want, as I wrap up this program, to really commend Tim for the work that he's doing on Manitou Island. It's not an easy place to decide that you're going to ban, just the remote nature of it, the having to plan to bring everything and know like how you're going to get those food resupplies. It's not a place that most people would want to do a full banding season investigation. Even though the birds there are incredible, there's just so many factors that make it a complicated place to get to. And in my opinion, it's probably one of the coolest places to research hawks and owls in the United States. And I'm so glad that Tim has been able to dedicate the last couple springs to figuring out how to do this. Um, and looking forward to 2026, Tim is hoping to have another full-length field season at Manitou. And his goals have been to increase the crew size. I think I alluded to this before, but it's really hard to do round-the-clock banding when you've just got like a two-person crew because it doesn't leave a lot of time for sleeping. And when the hawks are really moving on Manitou, it's just exhausting. And the weather is exhausting, and just like keeping up with life is exhausting. So have a bigger crew so you can sort of spread out those rough hours and deploy hopefully some modus tags on sharpshins, long-eareds, and saw-whets. put some satellite transmitters on sharp-shinned hawks and long-eared just to get more detailed knowledge about how these birds are moving around the Great Lakes, even when they're not showing up, in nets. And Manitou is a significant site for long-eared owls and sharp-shinned hawks, which I mentioned, and also for rough-legged hawks. There aren't any banding stations that catch a lot of rough-legged hawks, especially during spring, but Manitou has huge potential for this. Tim caught a few in 2025, and rough-legged hawks are a bird that we see a lot of on Manitou Island, so a good place to learn more about those. And you all can learn more about the 2025 season, see some really cool pictures that I did not include in this presentation by visiting Tim's Instagram page for the project. The account is Q&A Raptor Research there in bold. And yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about. I don't think I'm going to be able to go out to Manitou this spring, but definitely want to support Tim's efforts and hope that he can continue to learn these really cool things about the hawks and owls that use the Keweenaw Peninsula. I know that a common thought that I have on Manitou Island whenever I've had the pleasure of being out there is I'll see a bird start the Lake Superior crossing, and I have, so many questions for that bird, like, where are you going? What's your life gonna look like? You're gonna go to a place that I've never been before, and I might never go. And with banding, we can answer more of these questions that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get the answers to. So, thank you for joining me tonight, and I would like to open the floor up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was fascinating. We really appreciate your time and expertise. We do have a few questions in our chat, and I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please just type it in the chat and we'll read it aloud so everybody can hear the question and then get Allison's response. So the first question was, with the pigeons, do they receive any training, such as staying calm in the vest or training to not panic when put in the net system?
That's a great question. They don't have any particular training for that, although Tim has selected a lot of his pigeons and even bred his own pigeons for characteristics that make them better lure birds than if you were just gonna catch a wild pigeon. The pigeons are surprisingly chill. They don't really seem to care about being out um, in the vest, and they don't seem to care about being raised and lowered on the line too much. I didn't mention this before, but I just want to stress that Tim takes very, very, very good care of his pigeons, and none of the pigeons that we use are out there um, being actively used as a lure bird for a very long amount of time. When Tim came out for the full season in 2025, I think he had either 15 or 16 pigeons, and that was so that you could more equally distribute the physical exertion of being out there, being surrounded by hungry hawks, both the mental stress for that pigeon and also the physical stress of being up and down on the line, just so that no bird would get too tired. But he also he selects some of his birds for plumage. A bird that has more white in the wings, for example, is going to catch the eye of a hawk more than a bird that doesn't have that flashy markings. So I think that plumage characteristics are definitely important for the lure birds.
Thank you. Another question was, could you feed any of the island mice to these raptors since you have so many mice?
Um, you know, We, I don't think that we ever did end up feeding any of the mice to the raptors, but that was something that we had as a thought in the back of our mind. Sometimes, for example, you'll catch an owl really late in the night, and maybe it'll be a good idea to hold that owl until it gets dark again the next night because it would be vulnerable to let it out in the morning. And if you were going to do that, you would definitely give it a mouse. And we didn't have any shortage of mice, despite the amount that we trapped and killed. That first fall that my partner and I were out there, there are still mice on Manitou Island. The ones that we did kill, I would put out in the yard for the ravens, so they weren't just going to waste.
So amazing how many mice you have up there. Another question: where do the northern saw-whet migrate to?
So northern saw owls have a pretty large breeding range. Some of them do nest in the Upper Peninsula. A lot of them nest in Ontario. We don't know exactly where the birds that we're catching on Manitou are going, and that is part of the reason why it would be awesome to get some MODIS tags on some of these saw-whet owls, is so that we can get hopefully a more detailed knowledge of where they're going to nest.
Sure, that makes sense. Another question is your banding data shows a 500% increase in 2025. Can you explain?
I think that probably that huge increase is because of the longer season. In 2024, we were only banding for a week, and in 2025, those numbers were from a full 2 month season. So, if you adjusted the amount of net hours, from season to season and had those numbers scaled to match the hours that nets were open, you wouldn't have a 500% increase.
Um, that's all the questions that we have in the chat right now. I don't know if Donna has any follow-up questions for you, but we did have quite a few comments thanking you and saying how informative your talk was. So I'm going to turn it over to Donna to wrap it up.
All right, excellent. Thank you.
Allison, thanks so much. I've been really looking forward to this. I wanted to hear about the birds, but I also wanted to see what the living situation is up there. So that was also fascinating to me. Um, just the conditions under which you're living when you're up there. So thank you to Tim for doing the work and for everyone who's doing that work up there. It's so interesting. And we're just really grateful to you for sharing this information with us. I think someone else asked, how is this getting funded? So I'll throw that question out as maybe the last one.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The previous years, this project has been funded by Copper Country Bird Club, and I know that as the project is getting bigger, Tim is looking for and needing funding beyond that. I know that he has applied for some grants and is probably in the process of hearing back from some of those, but if any of you know of any funding avenues, if that's your area of expertise, like please get in contact with Tim, because this is a really wonderful thing that he's doing, and these sorts of projects are sometimes difficult to fund, and it's one of those things that needs and deserves all the help that it can be given. I
Um,
don't
and
know
and
that there is a website to donate. I just saw that question pop
yeah,
up in the chat. Um, but I can ask that to Tim and
and if we find out about it, we can send that information out. I don't know if it would be in an email to members or if it would be um, on some of our social media or in a newsletter. Um, but we can try to, if you have that information at some point, Allison, send it and we'll try to get it out to people.
absolutely, yeah. I will get back to you with that. Thank you.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you again. Thanks to everyone who came tonight. We had a lot of people on this meeting. So, Allison, people were intrigued by the topic, and so you were a big draw tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you in another month.
All right. Thank you,
All right.
everybody,
Good
for
night.
being here. Good night.
All right, Allison, thank you again. We appreciate it. Take care.